Please welcome former Governor Bill Ritter, former Senator Tim Wirth, Maggie L. Fox, who is a long-standing environmentalist. Let's give them a big round of applause, please.
So, good afternoon. The three of us, as you might imagine, have given our fair share of keynote speeches in our lives. And over the last couple of days decided, instead of doing another keynote, why don't we combine our discussion and just make this a conversation among the three of us. I was going to tout my book, but I'm going to just start with that and say I wrote a book, Powering Forward. I'm going to sign it after it. Part of what I'll talk about is going to be about that, but I think what we're going to do is start actually with...
the forward of the book you were
What's
gonna...
that? Well, the forward of the book is written by Senator Wirth, and he would argue that it's better than the rest of the book, but we go back and forth about that.
And I wrote a praising paragraph.
Yes, that's right. Maggie Fox wrote a blurb that praised it, so this is kind of like...
So this is a Bill's band.
Home week. But I think the starting point probably, because Tim was going to talk a little bit about Paris, but I'd like to think about this on the international, the national, the state, the local scale. And I think we all have experiences, a variety of experiences, but maybe if you want to start with that and talk just about internationally what you see.
Maybe do that last. Maybe we ought to come right.
You want to start at the bottom?
Sure, what if we start kind of focused where everybody here is coming from? I mean, my point of view is a really relatively simple one, and that starts with the election of Secretary Clinton in November. That it is absolutely imperative. I mean, this is not hyperbole by any means. It's absolutely imperative that that happen. And we all have to remember this is going to be tougher than we think. This is going to be more difficult than we think. This is not a lay down by any means. And each of us has an obligation to think about that and to work on it in every way we can. Having said that, I assume that we're going to win in November. And if, in fact, Hillary does win, then it seems to me that all of the discussion about polling and American attitudes toward climate change and so on pretty much has to goes out the window. Because with her victory, it's really game over. Where are business and industry in this country going to go for the next 8 years? What's going to happen in the courts? You know, they are going to be following on to a very aggressive program, and I am sure that she and her administration will have a very, very aggressive group of people focusing on energy, climate, environmental work. So it's a huge tipping point, but when that happens, much of what so many of us have been working on for a long time of getting people over to the want-to line will have happened. And then we can start to think about what other opportunities get brought along. And all of us have done a lot of thinking about sort of what do we do next. So there's only, in my view, only one poll. I was asked to talk about polling. There's only one poll, and that's one that happens the second Tuesday in November. And then after that, we have an opportunity to really think about opportunities and change, and I think we have a lot of ideas for doing that, so I'll stop there.
Can I go next?
Well, the title of mine was something about divided America. And so playing off of Tim for just a minute, there are two things I would add. One is that in order for the presumption that Hillary Clinton will be our next president, there's no one in here that gets to think that their policy work is a substitute for getting out and getting engaged in this election. Both of these gentlemen have been incredibly fine public servants, and I think the kind of NGO and policy work that everyone here does and I do is a form of public service, but nobody had to vote for us to get it done. And this election is a very serious one. And those of us who, like myself, who've done policy work for our careers, often think that because we spend so much time on our policy work that we are giving. And we are, there's no question about that, but it's utterly insufficient to the challenge. We actually have to get involved in this election and physically participate by reaching out to voters and being on the campaign trail. And there's two reasons for that. People don't win because we wish they would. We win when we work harder than the other side. And the other reason is that all of us need to be engaged with people that are not in our tribe. We need every day to be talking to people who don't understand most of the language we use 90% of the time. And it is both the most wonderful and humbling work. So if you're not knocking doors this fall, you need to talk to yourself and change that part of your schedule. There is no other thing that you are doing in the next few months that's not about talking to voters that is as important as that. That's my 2 cents. The last thing I would say is that polling, we've heard a lot about it in the last few days, and I don't think I heard, and I will stand corrected if I did, any recognition of the fact that polls today are almost all of, polling is a dying art. We cannot reach people, pollsters cannot reach people, and thinking that we know what the body politic is talking about and feeling because of polls is dead wrong. And one of the things that we have to do is actually get out and be around people who are not like us so that we're not relying on polls that can't reach most people to give us a window into how Americans are thinking, and because a lot of it feels very mysterious to all of us right now. I think there's no antidote for that. None of us are going to turn into pollsters. None of us are going to find a way to reach people through their cell phones, but we can actually talk to voters.
So I endorse both those, the different statements. I do come at it with maybe a little bit of a different vantage point, because the work that I've been doing at Colorado State University since I left the governor's office has largely been with states. And I did some work with the Obama administration making recommendations to the administration about how they could move a clean energy agenda without Congress acting. And while I think the president getting elected, the next president being a person who understands this issue and will move this issue, and right now the 2 presumptive candidates, that's only Secretary Clinton, that's vitally important in the United States, but it still is likely that the Congress could wind up being, as it is now, just totally stalemated on this issue. And if you don't have federal legislative help and you just have executive action, there's some difficulties with that. We saw a federal judge yesterday in Wyoming block the BLM's hydraulic fracturing rules, saying that Congress had not delegated the authority to the BLM. So an executive action can take you so far, but not as far as a willing Congress could take you. Thereby, we focus on states and cities. And at Paris, I talked about the role of subnationals and what subnationals can do, and that's where the lion's share of my work has been since I left. And part of the good news in this whole conversation is the shifts that we've seen over that 5-year period, where really it's still a partisan conversation in many places, many legislatures controlled by one party, and it's, they block any kind of effort on the clean energy stuff. But we've increasingly seen both Republican governors and county commissioners, mayors, move an agenda responding to local concerns, partly about climate change, partly about the business opportunities, partly about risk management and threat analysis and all these different kinds of things that are happening. And so to the extent, President Clinton Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton is elected, and she's serving after January of next year, what Maggie's saying about getting out and working on this agenda, I think there's 2 parts to it. Work every election up and down the ballot, and work it on this issue in as powerful a way as you possibly can as an individual or an organization. It really matters that people in elective office care about this. Senator Wirth and I were talking earlier today about the importance of public utility commissions in this equation. So we think a lot about elections and presidents and governors and senators and congresspeople. I tell you, utility commissioners have had a very significant role in holding back the kind of transition that we need at the speed that we need it. And that as we support governors or support elected officials, make sure that we're also thinking about elected utility commissioners, which happens in other parts of the state, but also appointed utility commissioners. And the final thing I'll say is, because we've seen this shifting of the conversation, particularly among conservatives and Republicans, and it's not all candy and flowers, and it's by no means complete. It's actually in what I would say it's fairly early stages. Part of why I wrote this book was to ask, how do we find common ground with people that disagree with us? How do we find a place for, to the extent the train leaves the station once Secretary Clinton is elected and this conversation is over, how do we find a place to have those folks part of the conversation about how we go forward? Because there are a lot of things that I think about as ways to solve this problem that they disagree with. Jay Faison, a billionaire, Clear Path Foundation, absolutely believes that climate change is real, believes that climate change is human caused, but does not believe in serious government interventions in the market. And so we need to think about how Jay Faison and I could sit down at a table, or Jay Faison and any of you sit down at a table and find a solution that might come to common ground, but have us working on that together in a collaborative way, and not have me think about Jay Faison as sort of the enemy or him think about me as the enemy. How do we do this together? Because in this country, if we figure out a way to do it together, we're going to have a far better work product at the end of the day than we have if just the people in this sort of room and what might even be considered an echo chamber, if we're the only ones trying to figure out how to solve this, it'll be an inferior result.
I was struck listening to a lot of the conversations yesterday and today about the generation of electricity and changes of doing that and so on, that John Powers is building in Denver, for example, Amory's fabulous presentation today at lunch. Every single one of those discussions that we had here depend upon state public utility commissions and what the states do with the utilities within that state. As Bill's saying, that's one of the hidden areas. If we want to get to scale and we want to make real progress, we've got to organize around who is on those PUCs, who are their friends in state legislatures, how do they change, what are the pathways to get them to adapt to the new world. They are largely, not very interested in adapting to a new world. That's not in their reward structure. It's not in a utilities reward structure for the most part. Business as usual, they know where their rate of return is going to be. They can predict that, they can look at that, and rocking the boat is generally not something that they're particularly comfortable with. So we have to figure out, and really good state action and really good environmental action, it seems to me, figures out what's the incentive program that can get those state legislators who are on the relevant committees, can get those commissioners to be thinking differently. It's a very different world. It's not nearly, somebody used the word describing what ought to be done yesterday as being sexy. I would think more likely it's being pesky. What we want to do is to be pesky with them and kind of help to move them and change them along and get them over a period of time to make the changes that we all think have to be made. This is not big policy schmolicy stuff. We're going to be on that. This is on the hard digging work, it seems to me, on a state-by-state level. Bill has done a great deal of that at his center in Fort Collins, and Maggie's done a lot of that, organizing around the country. So, like your, what's that level of opportunity?
Well, the one thing I'd say is that in my years in the Sierra Club, we actually did embrace that strategy for a while, and we'd have to ask Mike Brune where it is today, and because I haven't kept up. But one of the nicest things about public utility commissions, when they are elected as opposed to appointed, it's the only thing around that you can still afford to run a campaign on anymore, because the dollars are not what other kinds of races, like Alice Madden is here and she's running for statewide office as a regent of the state of Colorado, and she has to raise more money than people could comprehend.
More money I had to raise when I first ran for Congress.
Yeah, more money than Tim had to raise in his first time running for Congress. Whoa, that's painful. But these PUC races actually are not $0, but they are really small in a relative sense to the kind of engagement in elections that costs so much more in today's world. So it's very fruitful. It also involves something which I'm a huge proponent of, and I'll repeat it, and that is that you can mail into people who are voting on a PUC candidate, but you really have to go door to door. And every one of the PUC races, when we ran those campaigns in several states a number of years ago, that we won them when the candidates walked, and when we walked, and we lost them when they didn't. It's very much like state legislative races, but even smaller geographies in some cases, and other cases much larger geographies. So it's great organizing work, it's great training work, and it actually is very inexpensive in relative terms, and it has an enormous enormous impact. The one thing I would say that everybody here knows that most activists who are coming in as volunteers don't realize is that PUC commissioners, their work on climate and energy is almost always a small fraction of the job. Those jobs are really hard. They are often about, you know, what do you pay cab drivers, as Bill knows.
Cab drivers, telecommunications
I mean,
was the big issue in our PUC this year, but certainly I think they understand they have a big role in electricity generation as well.
Colorado's PUC is probably one of the most far along in the country in terms of grasping the significance. You know, you think who would be
They once were.
California? Yeah, well, when someone was governor, it was really
No, I
good.
think, you know, I think actually they've got a big set of cases in front of them, dockets in front of them now, and they're struggling with this. But just generally, this is a part of the shift that happened. 5 years ago, this wouldn't have happened at what's called a NARUC meeting, the National Association of Regulatory and Utility Commissioners. And the Clean Power Plan had already been stayed by the Supreme Court. So the work on that had slowed down, and they had a panel at NARUC on the Clean Power Plan. And the guy who's now the chair of the commission in Ohio stood up and said, you understand, even without the Clean Power Plan, our future is decarbonization. The word decarbonization might not have been uttered at a NARUC meeting 5 years ago. And I was at one exactly 5 years ago, and it was very political, and it was kind of after Obama had pushed out a clean energy agenda inside the stimulus package, and there was a great deal of division around that. And they've come back together with an understanding, utility commissioners with an understanding that, well, it's sort of happening. And we see this with governors. There's a clean energy accord where 4 Republican governors joined 13 Democratic governors to sign an accord saying we are moving in the direction of clean energy. And those things are good news pieces from sort of the subnational level. If you heard Jerry talk about sustainability in Denver, I'm having a conversation with the CEO of the Public Service Company of Colorado, which is an Xcel subsidiary, and he said their plan, Denver's plan, is something Xcel has to think about when they file their resource, because that's 20% of their load. And they have this, you know, this litigation we heard about today with Boulder that's ongoing, but this is as important as that litigation is Denver's sustainability plan, because they have to think about resource planning around what that municipality is going to do to transition to clean energy. So if you have cities on board, if you have states on board in a more serious way, then Congress, you know, Congress, it'd be great if they act, but if they fail to act, there are other ways to do this with subnationals involved, as long as you've got the right voting strategy and political strategy that supports getting the right policymakers elected.
Okay, if the themes that we all start with are urgency and scale, we have as a world a huge task ahead of us in terms of time and in terms of scale. And we can't get there without using the big existing institution, which are our state governments and our utilities. These are institutions to be used, and we all have to figure out how to best move them along. Let me try, if we had our sort of first theme here was, you know, election, 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 vote, 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 November. Second is think about these institutions at the state level, for the most part, that we've been mentioning, which are enormously important. Let me try a third area of, it seems to me, increasing opportunity, and that's what I would call solutions from the land. We have, in thinking about climate change, done various programs to try to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. We're increasingly concerned about ocean acidification and understand that we can no longer be assuming that the oceans are going to absorb a great deal of carbon. So what's the third source, the third potential sink? And that is the land, which I think has consumed remarkably little attention. The Paris Agenda had very little to do with that. The United Nations, where are my backyard for the last 20 plus years, has very little to do with that. In the United States, it's generally very hard to deal with an agricultural community, generally, that has been suspicious of government activity and government activity related to climate change in particular. So there are a lot of barriers there, but I think there are some very, very significant opportunities. Over to you, Maggie. I bet you've thought about this.
Well, in the spirit of, we're getting to the end of this conference, and this is about American renewable energy, there is a bigger agenda, and that is this, one of the most fascinating, terrifying, and energizing aspects of climate is that it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around the scope of the challenge or the size of the playing field. Every day we are made aware of another piece of the puzzle. Not too many years ago, a couple of years ago, I was in South Africa at a training with Climate Reality, and many of you have heard me say I was schooled by some activists who were doing some very powerful work on regenerative agriculture in Africa. And they came up to me, having signed up for this amazing training, and challenged me about why we weren't talking about it. And I, for once, was smart enough to look them right in the eye and said, I have no excuse. You better teach me right now. I came away from that conference and that conversation more heartened about the possibilities of a future for our own children and our grandchildren than I think I have been in a while. Most of us live with what I call disciplined optimism, chosen optimism. The more you know about this, choosing optimism is the way you choose to proceed in the work. But learning about the opportunities that regenerative agriculture gives us as a nation and as a world is the most hopeful thing I've heard in a very, very long time. And it goes beyond looking at the emissions that we are going to be putting into the atmosphere and actually focusing on a much larger challenge, which is what we've already done. And finding ways through very simple agricultural practices, which I won't go into because there are people here who are quite skilled at this, and I'm a newbie, a new passionate, fondly excited about working on this, is to help move this issue to the very beginning of all of our dockets instead of this vague footnote. The fact that Paris, which was such an extraordinary note of hope and promise and action that we had not seen in Copenhagen and many other international meetings, the fact that regenerative agriculture was still missing from the front of the storyline is an example of something beyond our own inability to imagine this playing field. And it is that we really are, our biggest enemy in this fight is not the fossil fuel industry, it's ourselves. And it has been forever. And I think, and I want to link the notion of looking at regenerative agriculture, and all of you, no matter what you are doing, no matter how many films, amazing films for children, how many new energy companies you're doing online, you need to get your head around this because we have to all be talking about it all the time. It is a scope of solution unlike anything in our emissions strategy. And we need to be focusing on it all the time. It is stunning. And it's not just stunning in its possibility, it's stunning in its simplicity. Everything is so complex and so hard. Embracing the simple understanding that the soil will save us, to borrow a title from a woman author who did such a magnificent job of taking a complex topic and simplifying it into the kind of way of understanding it that you just want to get off your chair and get moving. So I actually encourage every one of you and to bring it into all the conversations that you're having with the people that you work with and those who you are reaching through your various advocacy strategies. But I also want to just key on to something I hope we can talk about for a minute, and that is that we've had a number of conversations about communication. I started out like all of you. I'm a policy freak. I love it. It's fun. It's where I got my passion for this work. But I learned the hard way that the beautiful conversations that we have with each other reach only each other quite a long time ago. Paul was up here a while ago, and I think it was David Fenton this morning who talked to us about our telepathic communication strategies. We really can do so much better, and we really must. So I just want to leave it on that note for right now, because as you move out in your amazing work, and as you do embrace these strategies, and as we all reach out to learn more about regenerative agriculture and actually become part of it, when we talk about it, we actually need to do a better job than what we've been doing as we talk about some of the exciting things that we do. So,
Well, I was going to say the two are really linked in my mind. So I was born and raised on a farm and understand farmers and ranchers pretty well. And when I was governor, it was always fun for me to be on the Eastern Plains because that's really where I was from. But there are a lot of very politically conservative people there, and still it was important to sit with them and to talk with them, so communicate with them in a way that was about listening as well. The thing that farmers understand, so if you look at the 20-year average in Colorado of the profit margin across 20 years of farmers, not ranchers, just farmers, it's about 2% per annum. And it's the smallest of any of the industries, and it's the third biggest industry in Colorado is agriculture. And so if you start talking about how farmers might participate in a carbon market by looking at changing tilling practices or looking at changing growing practices, grazing practices, those kinds of things wound up having, there's some interest there. And if you include in that some other kinds of new energy things where farmers are able to participate in reducing emissions but make money doing it, they understand that. They understand that in a big way, and that's sort of this common ground way of communicating, but you're never going to be able to convince people to do that unless you sit and listen to them first, talk about their areas of concern, their issues, and largely they're going to be financial and they're going to be economic if you're on the Eastern Plains of Colorado. So this is this really fertile place, no pun intended, for the next president, I think, to go. There's a variety of things happen at the federal government. In the federal government, you could coordinate those things, bring them together, but thinking about the land and agricultural practices. The second part of it, and it's something specific to the West, is about public lands. So 85% of Nevada is federally owned. It's about 45% of Colorado. Idaho is 66%, but most Western states have a federal footprint like that. And also having a state-federal program where we're thinking about public lands, not unlike the way we think about agricultural lands as being part of this transition to a clean energy agenda, is really an important thing for the next administration, important for state legislatures, and I would say, important for elected officials, sort of up and down the grade.
up and down.
Bill and I were saying earlier, the three of us were talking earlier, but saw this very issue, that it may be going into next January that the most important cabinet office is not going to be EPA, it's not going to be energy, it's going to be the Department of the Interior, because the Department of the Interior is going to touch so many of these energy, so many public lands issues, and that is going to spill over into lots of other strategies that we are trying to undertake as a country. Another one of which is how do we take care of the people who are really getting shut out of the future because their economy was, say, a coal economy. How do we take care of them in this energy transition so that they're part of America as well? Very large challenge and incredibly interesting one for us all to be thinking about and be sensitive to. I want to bring up one item, and we'll have some time for questions, and one that runs through here, and that is pricing carbon. That is an arena that is beginning. I think my hunch is that more is going to happen there more rapidly than people think. They say, oh, no, you'll never get a price on carbon, we'll be able to do it. I think there's some very interesting thinking going on the right about if you were to develop some kind of a carbon fee package, what would you get for it from the left in terms of regulatory relief or administrative relief? What's the balance that goes on here? How might you use some kind of a carbon fee to help to take care of, again, that part of America that's been left behind? There are a variety of opportunities that exist in thinking in a new way about carbon pricing. And we've just begun to scratch that. And I hope that that's something that the new administration and the new Treasury Department really takes on in a very serious way, and I think that they will. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. You were mentioning it now too, Bill.
I wanted to talk about the front page of the Denver Post today, which had a story about Peabody Energy missing its quarterly tax payment to Routt County. One company, one county. But the gist of the story is that failure to pay that quarterly tax is going to impact schools, emergency responders, and the public health system in Routt County. So that's Steamboat and parts around it, but they have significant coal communities. And so, Tim, we think a lot about coal workers, but it's entire communities that are going to be impacted by that. And I know there's a variety of thinking about how we make sure in that transition, I call it a just transition in this book, how that happens in sort of a just fashion for both individuals and communities that have really dedicated their life to having coal-fired generation in this country, which helped us build a middle class and a manufacturing economy and an industrial prowess. All those things have been part of it. So there really is a justice notion in how we ensure that that transition happens. But the front page of the Denver Post, it was just such a coincidence that we're having this discussion today, and it's about a county that is actually going to look at having to lay off school teachers because one company missed one quarterly payment, and that company's currently in bankruptcy.
Right.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, the last thing I'd say is sort of on the notion of communication, because we've known really as long as any of us have been involved in these issues that a price on carbon is a fundamental premise of a solution for the long term, for the short term, for any term. But we still haven't found a way to communicate it well. Price of carbon is the most neutral. It doesn't word the wicked word tax. It doesn't use even fee, even though the concept is exactly the same. And being smart about talking about a price on carbon in the right words and in the right places is really critical. But more important than that is that one of our challenges, as we all know, is the inconsistency of our messages, the diversity of them, the absence of clarity, the absence of emotional words, and also the fact that whenever we do communication strategies, they are often very short-lived. So even those that have been good, and not so many have been, in terms of their reach and their ability to talk to people that are not like us, when we do them, we actually have not usually had the kind of funding to penetrate so that these terms become part of the parlance. You can't win a legislative battle when the words that define it don't exist in the vernacular of the public. And so we actually have to not just think about those policies, we have to talk about them all the time, even when the audiences that we're talking to are not entirely sure of what we mean, until these words become part of the conversation all the time on the solution set, because it actually is going to have to be a part of the solution set, along with regenerative agriculture.
So we're right back to sort of where this whole program for the last 3 days started, is thinking about this communication, Fenton's panel, and so on. We have about 12 or 15 minutes for any kind of questions or comments from the floor.
18.
18
We have
minutes.
18 minutes.
We have 18 minutes. That's pretty good.
That's what happens when you merge.
Go to you.
Mergers are good. Mergers are good. You get more time.
Great.
On the regenerative agriculture.
Could everybody could identify yourself so we know too? That'd be- There we go.
You could bow. You could also bow for the camera. There you go.
My name's Chris Bentley. I'm the CEO of the Good Energy Guild, which CEO stands for Clean Energy Optimist.
Good.
When I was in Paris, I stayed for 8 or 9 nights at a hotel, the St. Christopher Inn, that was filled with the whole regenerative agriculture group. And they were having meetings from 8 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night, all about the subject. And I like to start businesses and build them up and sell them. And I was so tuned in trying to find a business opportunity
Yes.
in regenerative agriculture. And since I've been communicating with Ronnie Cummins and all the leaders of that, and I cannot find where you can do like you can in solar and wind and other.
No, many of us might know a gentleman by the name of Reuben Munger, who's actually been on the same search. So I'll connect you. He's
But
actually
anyway, this is
doing
not
it.
an unusual request. I think that it's a very, very diffuse world out there that's really maturing in terms of looking at this and the opportunities. That this is a different way of looking at agriculture and looking at the lands. There's a point right over here on the same issue, I think, right?
Just one last quick question on this. Would any of you guys entertain the idea, why or why not, of becoming a part of Clinton's administration at a high level?
There's a long list of humans out there.
Not as good as you guys.
Hi, Janice Hall, Natural Network International. I couldn't be more excited about hearing regenerative agriculture on the radar because I've been championing it for a number of years, as you might have seen with the soil story on the Eiffel Tower. But for those of you who want to know more, there is a group called Regeneration International, and they have a very, very deep website, and the carbon with Vandana Shiva and a number of people, and Ronnie Cummins, of course, is involved. And the Carbon Underground is another group. Tom Newmark has been here. It's not a question. I just wanted to add more volume to the carbon sequestration from agriculture. It's a very powerful story, and it's the low-tech story for sequestering legacy carbon.
Right.
You know.
Well, this Secretary of Agriculture has beginning to move the Department of Agriculture to start to think about this. The philanthropic community, which has got hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, has, I think, started to recognize this problem. I'm not sure, but I think they've started to recognize this problem. I mean, it's a really open agenda, I think, and the more we can get together, you pull your people together, and the more I think at a leverage institutional high level, we got to bring together, who are the best people, where are they going, and how do we help to frame an agenda for the new administration coming in, because it's exceedingly important.
There's a lot of work at CSU happening on this because we're a land-grant university, and agriculture is sort of one of the mainstays at Colorado State. So they're actually doing a variety of things. When I was governor, we put in place a 5-year demonstration program on low-till, no-till, and looking at the carbon sink part of that, but also on rotational grazing. And so if there's a carbon market that allows ag to play in that carbon market with different tilling and different grazing, I think you would see this take off, at least in the United States, in a bigger way.
There's a lot of economic opportunity, and it creates
Let's go to
better
other
topsoil and better produce and jobs.
We got 10 minutes here. We got a lot of questions. Go ahead.
Tim, Maggie, Bill's just sitting there smiling because he knows where I'm going to go with this.
Well, then we don't have to go to somebody else.
But you haven't heard it, Coach. So at our panel's presentation, the first thing I said was, this is the first year, and I've been doing natural terrestrial sequestration research mostly in the state of Colorado, but in the country for the last 12 years. And the first thing I said was, this is the first time I've been to a non-geology conference where carbon sequestration, the potentials of soils is mentioned. I stopped counting at 130 times. I was delighted. But so it is something that even our political leaders are beginning to really recognize the importance of. And I agree completely, Department of Interior and collaboration and moving this forward with the next administration. You're the people to do it. I want to move to the PUC because, as Maggie and Bill well know, I've been interviewing at the PUC for, my God, 22 years. We have to deal with stranding all of these coal-fired power plants, the things that the PUCs aren't going to deal with. How are we going to move this one forward? And I'm bringing it up at this conference. It's a complex issue, but I think the people at AREDAY are the ones to begin figuring out how to communicate that whole issue to the public. And you three are probably the best three to help us begin that conversation.
Any comments from the two of you?
Well, this is it's such a big conversation. So
It's big.
one of the things that my center was doing was convening the 13 western states on the Clean Power Plan. We still actually are convening the states. It's just 10 now. 3 have dropped out since the stay, but we're still coming together. And there's a business as usual case where there's a lot of coal that's going to be retired anyway, but most of that happens at the sort of day where they were going to go out of business. And utilities are now understanding that they're going to probably accelerate the retirement of coal. This is a big conversation in Montana. At Colstrip, there's legislation in Washington that looked at bringing no more coal over the wires into Washington from Montana. Wyoming and Montana are big exporting states. They export coal out, and so they understand, right, that they're going to be in the business of stranding assets. And so there's a few parts to it. One is, how do you rate base that? And if it's a single community, that is sort of forcing that? Do you force that community to pay the greater rate that comes with stranding that asset, or do you base that across the entire rate? Utility commissions are going to have to answer that question. They're thinking about it now. Dismantlement costs, if you accelerate the shutdown of coal, do you dismantle it right away, or do you leave it on the books? And there's some people thinking, just leave it on the books, keep paying for it like you've been paying for it. The new cost associated is, we learned today at lunch from Amory, there's new renewables that are as cheaper than some of the levelized cost of coal, and there's a way to actually count that as a new cost, but still keep this on the books and not make it a ratepayer burn. So utility commissions are looking at it. I don't think there's one answer to this, but I can tell you the utility commissions are thinking every day about this, because they know as we accelerate the shutdown of coal, there's going to be stranded assets.
Amory, we've quoted you a number of times today. Is somebody give Amory a microphone?
Well, they
He's
do.
so shy about this sort of thing.
Well,
Amory, where's the microphone? You got a microphone?
well,
Why don't you come up so everybody can hear, Amory? We got a microphone coming along here. Here we go.
I want to call your attention to a really
You
important
got to speak
thing
into it, Amory.
that
There
was
you go.
to a really important announcement that came out early Tuesday morning. Pacific Gas and Electric, after negotiations with Friends of the Earth and Natural Resources Defense Council and the electrical workers and the local anti-nuclear groups and so on, announced a formal agreement and proposal to close down the Diablo Canyon twin unit nuclear plant, which is running very well, over the next 8 or 9 years. And importantly, nobody's made this coupling before, to ramp up efficiency and renewables to replace it, so that no more fossil fuel will be burned. It'll be ramped up timely. There won't be a gap. No more carbon will be released. Rates won't go up, because they say, although they didn't put a number on it, it will be cheaper to do that substitution than to keep running the plant. And what that's about is that 40-year-old plants are like an old car. Stuff goes wrong, it gets expensive, you have to keep fixing it. And by avoiding the rather high operating costs, they can buy renewables cheaper. NRDC says $1 billion cheaper. I think that, or at least, that's plausible. But let me add a point that was in my Forbes blog the following morning, and a lot of folks have missed, including Bloomberg. The renewables and efficiency are cheaper by more than twofold than continuing to run that plant, or any of the top quartile of nuclear plants. So if you shut down Diablo, every kilowatt hour you don't generate saves you 7 cents, or for the top quartile, over 6 cents of operating cost. With that, you can buy 2 or 3 kilowatt hours of efficiency at the average U.S. price of 2 or 3 cents each. You can use one of those to replace the nuclear plant, the other 1 or 2 to displace fossil fuel generation.
Okay, Amory,
You only have 5
you've
minutes.
had your day.
And you end up saving at least as much carbon as if you closed a fossil
We're
plant.
for you, Amory.
So,
I think we have time for, let's do
Can I
two
just say-
more quick questions.
Can I say one
Okay.
thing in response to this? But this is part of the revolution.
Yeah.
We're talking about, this would have been unheard of, right? Exelon's
right.
going to close 2 plants in Illinois. They're going to close down a plant in New York. There's a great number of people out there saying, well, it's got to be natural gas it'll be replaced with. Pacific Gas and Electric says we're not going to replace with natural gas. We're going to expand the energy market, greater area in the West. We're going to be able to expand the geographic place that the load comes from, and we're going to get to 100% renewables as one of the 3 biggest utilities in California. It's really a tremendous thing that's happened in a very short amount of time.
why do you think we
Come
think
back.
the PUC campaign's a good idea?
Yeah, coming back here.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay.
can.
My name's Suzanne, and I've been organizing with an organization called Frack Free Colorado for the past over 3 years, just as a volunteer that has gotten sort of obsessed with the issue, and been organizing in my community and surrounding communities, and I played a big part in the local control measures, so the bans and moratoria in the state. And in these climate talks, I noticed that there's a lot of focus around the carbon, but less talk about methane, fugitive methane that's happening. And the thing that interests me most, I guess, is that I feel like there's a huge divide between what is happening in the grassroots and sort of politically, and I wonder how that divide can be bridged, or if that can be bridged, because I know that on the ground in communities, you know, we have failing air quality in the Front Range, NOAA says, because of fracking. How do we, one, how do we address this? How do we address the methane and the ground level ozone? But also, how do we bridge the divide that seems to be occurring between communities and local politics?
There are probably a lot of thoughts about that. I'll give you just a very quick story. Maggie and I were together in Copenhagen 6 or 7 years ago, and there was an international colloquium, first time fracking had ever come up. And we were making the case to the industry people that if you all don't do this in a much different and more responsible way, you're going to lose your license to operate. Now, I thought that was a pretty stark contrast at the time, but I think it's really coming out that way now. And we're getting to more of a confrontation than we have to, it seems to me, over the whole fracking industry and what happens to that over the next 15 to 20 years. I used to be more optimistic than I am now that the industry would be, you know, willing to really understand the kinds of problems that it was facing and that it was reluctant to do, as it was saying we have a right to put a hole in the ground any place we want to. I think that time has come and gone.
So the tack I took as governor that I continue to take is to say you have to have a really strong set of regulations because it loses all of its climate benefit if you replace coal with gas but don't capture methane along the value chain. I think the Environmental Defense Fund has really tried to understand the level of methane, fugitive methane, or methane leakage along the value chain. But if you have a really strong set of regulations, and if you have a culture of compliance, and if you have strong enforcement when there are lapses, then at least you can look for a climate benefit, and it's a fairly cheap source of reliable gas. Now, I think the EPA made a big bet on natural gas in the Clean Power Plan, and it's less of a bet now in the final rule than it was in the proposed draft, but it is sort of a way to say at the federal level, natural gas is going to be with us for some time, and I don't know how much that time is, but the thing to do if you're going to recognize that it's going to be here is regulate it very tightly, and Colorado has arguably the best set of regulations in the country. How do you solve that dilemma that exists, or that divide that exists between people who are just opposed to it and people who think, well, I think we have to have it, but we need to regulate it really tightly? That's a great question. I'd love to talk to you about it because I'm one of the people that think it's here, we have it, we have to regulate it very well. But in order for them to have their social license to operate, there also has to be a culture of compliance inside of industry.
Last comment to Maggie.
I would just say, when this whole thing broke open, I said to my husband and to other people in elected office that they were misunderstanding that the reason people are so angry about this is because they feel fracked. And that's still missing. I think I was the one that said to a gentleman who's no longer with us from the oil and gas industry that they really better get this, because what most of us don't know, and I didn't for a very long time, is that the fracking technology that exists today is because the oil and gas industry got a tax credit over the last 27 years to pay for the research that allowed them to break through this layer and get to those pools. The bottom line is that we have enormous conflict in our society, and the word fracking, I think, is not just about what's happening with natural gas in schools and in communities where it's come into our lives, much more than any energy development has ever come into our lives. And it is about a bigger and larger feeling that has a lot to do with climate change and the changes that are happening in the natural world. So I think you, as someone who's on the front lines, just needs to understand in here what public policymakers need to understand, which is this is bigger and deeper than the specific issue. It is a reflection of the closeness that energy development has come into. We didn't have energy, we fought projects like power plants. We didn't actually have projects that came into schoolyards and in communities the way they do now. And the process of figuring out how to fix that is going to be tough. And it's a very important battle, but I would urge you to think about the fact that as we fight it, it's about more than just the specific issue. it's a larger battle about how we manage our lives in a 21st century world of energy development that's changing so rapidly, people don't know what's happening.
A lot of challenges from this panel. We thank you all very much for good
Thank
comments
you.
and questions.